Today we're going to be taking a look at how to sort our chat rooms as well as our user direct messages whenever a new message comes in. So you can see here by default we're sorting the messages by the time, and then at the bottom it's any chats we have where a message hasn't been sent yet, because right now we're just displaying all the users. And in the chat rooms it's similar. We have the chats separated by the last time the messages were sent. And I think I might even have a chat room or two in here that doesn't have anything. And these are, they're just going to show a blank message for now. But you get the idea. So the way that we're going to do this, if I exit out of this and I come over to a local application, I'll start the server so we can see what we have right now. But basically, we're not going to be doing this logic too much on the server side. It's mostly going to be done on the client side. And the reason for that is we need to sort of figure out when the message was organized, send it to a specific user. And for the users especially, because we have this, let me bump up the font size real quick. So because we have this room name right here, where we call get room, and then we're constructing the room this way, and then we're like setting up the single room from here. We can't really use the same logic to sort of sort our rooms just because of how this works, because there's no way for us to get this single room through like a user dot single room call. So instead we'll be doing this from the front end, which is a bit more performant anyways, I think. So what we're going to start by doing is we're just going to add in a quick little bit to our style sheet just so we can get that out of the way. I think it's in the chat room. And if I look at the get diff, the only thing we need to add is a class to our last message here. So we're just adding a class for the last message time because we're going to be adding a timestamp to the messages. We're then going to need to use our users inside of one of our models because we're going to be telling it when we sent or who sent a message. So we're going to have a sender. And for that, we can come into the application controller and we can do a before action to set current user. We'll come down to this private and we'll say def set current user end. And then in here, we just want to do Current.User equals current user. And some of you might be familiar with this, but basically we're going to be creating a Singleton class that just has a user object inside of it that we can reference. So a Singleton is basically a static class that you only have one instance of course, because it's static. But it just allows you to store sort of like a global variable here that we can use throughout the application. So we'll right click, we'll create a new file, call it current.rb. And you can of course put a whole bunch of stuff in here. But the main thing that we need to do is we need to say the class is current and it's going to inherit from active support current attributes. And then after that, we can just give it an attribute of user. And that's going to allow us to use the Current.User throughout our application. So now we're going to want to come into our room.rb because in here we're going to be broadcasting some stuff. So we'll come down here to the broadcast latest message and we're going to be adding a little bit. So we already have our target here, which is the room underscore ID last message, but I'm going to change this to be room target. I'm going to copy this and paste it in here. And then below the room target, we also need a user target. And it's going to be the room underscore ID again. And we could probably change this user last message. So what we can do is we can just grab both of these, store them in a variable, or we can just use the ID there if we want to. And then the last one we'll need is a sender, which is going to be equal to current.user. So this is how we get our user, because if we try to do current underscore user, it's not going to work here because it doesn't have access to the global state, I think is what they call it. But we want to say last message.user because our room has a last message and or I guess it has a latest message, which we're setting here and we're grabbing from the messages. So we want to check if the last message's user is equal to the current.user. So in that case, it means that, like, for example, I was the last one to send it because the last message was sent by me. And if it's not, then it means that the other person was the last person to send the message. So it's going to be the last message.user. So you can sort of see what we're using this logic here for. It's just going to be so we can like change the text depending on if I sent the message. So it'll say like me, whatever. or if someone else sent the message, then we can say like that last message.user.email said X or whatever. But in order to do this, we need to broadcast to a second channel. So we're going to come down here and I'm going to tab this over. I don't know why Rails feels the need to indent so far, but whatever. So we need to change this to our user target. We're going to render the users / last message. And then we need to add a sender : sender. So we're just going to pass this into our partials here. And I actually don't know how many of these partials we have created already. So let's take a look. We'll pop into views, our rooms, which does have a last message, and our users doesn't. Okay. So let's start by making the rooms work. So we're going to come into the last message here. And remember how we added that CSS in here for the last message time? That's because we're going to be adding that class in here. And we can do this by effectively changing this last message right here. So we're just going to say this needs a content _ tag. It's going to be for an EM because that's what we had down here. Oops. And then after the EM, we'll give it a class of, and I think we called it last message time in our CSS file. And then we'll give it some data. Oh, and it's tab 9 already knows what I'm going after here. So we're going to give it some data with a time, and the time is just going to be the last message .created at .2i, I think. And the reason why we're doing 2i is just because we're going to be comparing these date time values. And I think 2i changes it into like the time since epoch. So it's going to be like, time since 1970 or something. But your number is going to be something like this. And then you could compare that to, I don't know, 195033 or whatever. And then you can tell which message is bigger. So that's why we're doing the 2i call right there. Okay, now that that's done, we can come into our room partial, which is going to be _room.html.erb. And in here, I think we need to change a couple things. So it looks like I largely changed a lot of this. So we're just going to tab this down for now. So the first thing I did is I check if the user is in the current room. So because we're iterating through the rooms, I grab the room's ID and I check if it's equal to the Current.User.current room because we're setting the current user's current room in the controller, or at least we should be. I don't know if we actually changed that yet. Let me come into the rooms controller, I guess, so we can check if we change that. Yeah, so it looks like in here, we need to do like on line 9, Current.User.update. We want to update the current_room to be nil. So if we're on an index page, we're not in a current room, so this needs to be nil. And then if we're in a show page, we need to do, reading off my second screen, we need to do a current_user.update for the current_room, which we're going to set to the @single_room.id. And this is just similar to what we have, I think, in the users controller. So let me exit out of full screen real quick and come back to the Heroku app. So the way this works, if I click on one of these, or I guess even right now, this is just how we're highlighting the current users. And we're doing it now for the rooms as well, because I don't think the application had it for the rooms prior to this update. So we can come in here and this should change it so it works with the rooms as well. And we can even come into the users controller and it should be setting the current room somewhere, _room, or it's not. Nope, I was actually setting it in here in my other application. So this just happens after the single room. I'm just doing another current_user.update current room @single room. And it looks like in here, I'm not even doing the ID call. So we could probably even come into here and change this ID to just be the current room. Okay, so that looks cleaned up. We can now come back to whatever we were doing a second ago inside of our room.html.erb. So if we're in this room, we can then set a variable, which we'll call isActive, which we'll just set to a string. Else we'll set isActive equal to the empty string. And then we can say end. And we can tab this over and this over. And I think inside of our user partial, yeah, in here we were already doing something like this. So this should now handle the activity for the room, which is just a nice little bonus. And now we can do a room div. And inside of this room div, we will grab something from our room container, because I think I actually largely broke this out of the room container. So I'm going to grab this and come over to the room partial, and I'm just going to paste this in so we can take a look at what we have here. So I have this div here with a is active at the end of it. So that's going to add the class to our list item, which is of course what's going to get highlighted. We then have a row with our column-12, justify all of our content. And then we have a link to our room name, but this actually gets wrapped in a turbo frame tag. So we'll say underscore turbo frame tag, and it's going to have a DOM ID of room. And then we'll say do. And then I think we end it right here. So that allows us to broadcast to this specific ID, but we don't broadcast to the joinable link. Otherwise, it would change it if I come in here. Say someone sends a message to one of these rooms. Let me come over to the actual application. So like, let's say they send a message inside of general, and I'm not in general, so my button's green. When they send the message, if we broadcast to that room right now, it would change my icon to green, even though I'm still in the room. And then when I refresh, it'd go back to gray. So obviously we don't want that. So that's why we're breaking it out a bit here. And then we have the render for the joinable room, and we have the turbo frame tag for this ID right here, which means we don't need this one down here. Okay, so this sort of eliminates the room container. This can probably get refactored in the future. But now we can come into our index.html.erb, which is our last view for the rooms that we need to modify. And all we really want to do here is come down to, it looks like line 26, which has the rooms controller, or the rooms ID. We want to say data-controller is equal to room-list, because we're going to be creating a stimulus controller in a second here. Now, this is largely going to be replicated for the users. So in the users, we can create a new file and call this underscore last underscore message.html.erb. And if we come into here, it's going to look similar to the last message for the room tag. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to say unless the last message is nil, then do something. If it is nil, then don't do anything. We then want to grab this and say create a row. And then inside of this row, we want to grab that same snippet from our, I think, room partial, where we say div class column-12 d-flex align item center, justify content in between. And we can close this. And in here, we want to do similar to what we did in the last message for the user with this right here. We'll paste this in. And basically what we're doing is we're saying, put an emphasis on when the message was sent. So we have the last message.user.email sent a message, which we truncate at 40 just to keep it within the size constraints that we have. And then after that, we do another content tag, which I think was just being suggested to me. I can come into the last message here and grab this content tag right here, and we can paste this in. And what we're doing is we're just saying, give this an EM. It's going to have a class of last message time, and it's going to have data of time.last message created at .2i. And then we can come back to the last message, and we can grab this last bit right here where we do the last message for the time ago in words. And we'll just paste this in right here. My mouse is being a little weird. We can come in here, hit enter. And I think this actually needs a do block, and then it's going to need an end block. And let me just make sure that the other last message had that. This needs a do, and it needs an end. We can save that. Now, one thing is in the case of the users and in the case of the rooms, our logic is going to be very similar for our stimulus controllers. And it's also going to be similar for how we do the underscore user.html.erb. So I'm going to come into the room partial. I'm just going to copy this. We're going to come back to the user, and then I'm going to paste this in, and we'll just modify a little bit. I'm actually going to paste it in right here so we can leave the old is active logic. So we have the @singleRoom and @singleRoom.participant that we were using before. So the first thing is we need to change this from a room to a user. And we need to change this from a room list item to a user list item. We then have the part for our user avatar, which should be, I think, and I'll just tab down real quick so I can just explain this. We had the icon container. We had a link to the image tag for the user.chat avatar with a chat PFP and a link to the user. We then had our TurboStream from for the user status. And then we just render the user/status. So that is our little profile picture with the status symbol on it. We then have, we don't have this. We instead just have a link to the user email. Oops. So I'll just do this. So it's linked to the user.email with a user class ms-2 me-auto username, and the data turbo is false. And then the last thing that we have isn't this DOM ID for the room, but it's going to be a turbo_frame_tag. We also don't need this joinable link yet. It's going to be a turbo frame tag that has a, DOM ID of room, and it's going to be the user_last_message due. We could say end right here. And then for this, we want to render the user/last_message. It's going to take in a last message equal to last message, which will get passed in as well. And then it needs to take in a sender, which is just going to be the passed in sender. So we're going to have to pass both of those in from higher up, which means we have to come into a different partial. So we can create a new file here. Say _users.html.erb. And I think if we come into the index file maybe, and we come to the users, basically we're going to change this to render that partial. So just like down here where we had the room list, we also need to give this a data-controller. And this is going to be equal to the user list. And then we're going to change this to render users/users. And we're going to pass in users equals @users. And then we're going to come into the users file right here. And what we'll do is we'll say users.each do user. And then we can come down here and do an end. And then we want to construct a sender, which the logic is already here thanks to one of my autocompletes. And the sender here is going to be equal to the current user if it's the current user. Otherwise, it'll be equal to the sender. I actually think this is a bit of a mistake here. I think this needs to just be the user, not the sender. I think I might have had a bug in my other code. So let me come in here and I will say we need to do a room name, which is going to be equal to get name for the user and the current user. And for this, we need to come into, I think, the rooms controller, scroll down, and we'll grab the, where is it? Maybe it's the users controller. Yeah, it's in the users controller. We're going to grab this get name call right here. And instead, what we'll do is we'll come into the rooms helper, I guess. So we'll come down to the, come into the helpers right here, rooms helper. And we can do a def for get name, or I guess we can just paste it in here, and then we can save that. And that'll allow us to use that inside of that file, which should also allow us to use it in the views. So we can come back into the users.html.erb. Now we can create the single room, which I think should just be available to us as @singleRoom. But what we can do instead is we can come into the index and we can just pass in the single room as @singleRoom. I don't know if that's necessary, but just in case, I'll leave it like that. Okay, and then we can do a render for users/user. And now this is going to take in a couple things. We need to pass in the user. We need to pass in the last message which is going to be single_room and last message, which just does a null check to see if single room is defined. We then need to pass in the sender, which is going to be sender. And I'm wondering if this is the same thing here because this feels like it's going to be a little bit different. And I'm wondering if this is correct because the sender and the user are sort of interchangeable here. I'm not really sure, but we'll check on that in a second. We can then do room, which is single_room. And then that will get passed into the user partial where we, of course, use all of these things. So we do use the user and we do pass in the sender. So all of that seems fine. I guess the sender could be the current user. I'm just not thinking right because it's so late. But okay, now I think we have everything set up so that the only thing left is the JavaScript. So let me come over to our application real quick and refresh to see what blows up. Oh, let me full screen this. Okay, I think I found out why the single room being defined in here is required, and it's because we don't have the single room being set in our index. So instead what we're doing here is we're going to replicate the logic from the single room call in our controller. So we'll come into our rooms controller. We'll find where we're doing a single room for the user. Let's actually go into the user's controller. So we'll grab this and we'll paste it into our users right here, right above this. Oops, let's do this. We can paste it in. This looks a little weird. And then I'll walk through it real quick. So basically the reason why we're doing it in here is because when we're on the index page, we don't have access to whatever room this is. So we need, because we're iterating through this, it gives us access to it. So what we can do is we can say, create the single room without the at, room.where name is room name first, and or room is create private room, which means we can come into our index and we can get rid of the single room in here. And we can leave it in the users here like this. We already have the room name being defined. We have the user and we have the room name and we have the current user because this isn't being hit with a turbo frame partial render. So now if I refresh, we'll get a different error for the single room, which has it's not last message, it's latest message. I don't know why I keep doing that. And then I'll refresh. And now we're looking a bit better. So we have our rooms down here and we don't have any users in the application except for myself. So let me go ahead and open up an incognito tab over to localhost and I'll just create a user real quick. And I probably need to put a equals sign right here so we can actually see the user. There we go. So now we have our users appearing here with our latest message timestamps all set up and our rooms down here with the styling a little bit broken. I bet this is why. So let's get rid of this. We don't need the EM tags in there. And I'll save this. We can refresh. Oh, I think I did it again. Maybe this needs the equal sign right here. I'll save this. Come in here and refresh. Yeah, okay, so that was it. Now if I search for a new room, we still have the buttons. Okay, so everything here looks fine. So now we have all of that working. It's now time for the last leg of our journey. We need to actually sort these when a new message is sent. And the way that we can do this is we can come into our console, I guess. So I'll close this, open this up, and I'll bump up the font size again. And what we can do is we can say Rails G stimulus. We want to generate a room underscore list, which will create our room list. And we want to create a user underscore list, which will create our user list controller. And that'll give us both of our stimulus controllers to play around with. Now, let me close all this. We can come into app, JavaScript, and we'll go into channels and appearance channel first because I want to scroll down here. Last time we changed how the reset timer worked, but I forgot to change the time in seconds back to 1. So you were probably taking 25 minutes to go away instead of 1 minute. So this should fix it, or instead of 5 minutes. So that takes care of that. We can now come into our controllers and both of our new controllers, and we can get started with quite a bit of JavaScript. So in here, we have the connect. We don't need this. We'll instead use an initialize. And what we'll do is we'll start by grabbing the rooms element by calling document.getElementById. And then we'll call this.initialModifyRooms as a method, which of course means we have to create the initial modify rooms method, which will take in the rooms object that we just grabbed. We can then start by doing a sorted list, which is going to be equal to sort by last message rooms. We can then do a rooms.inner HTML after we're done sorting equal to the empty string. And then we can do sorted list.forEach append child. So for this, we're going to return a list of rooms. We're going to say for each room in that list of rooms, append the room to this element in the DOM. So we, of course, need to define this sort by last message method or function. So we can come down here and we can say, what did I do? I think what I did was I actually put in a comment for GitHub Copilot because I was too lazy to Google how to do this. And then I just hoped that it gave me something that worked. And in this case, it's not giving me what I got, but it actually managed to get pretty close. So it started by doing a const room list is equal to rooms.querySelectorAll, which is grabbing all of the elements by the class name of room, which we set previously. So now we have all of the rooms. We then do a sorted list, which is an interesting snippet of code. So it's a const sorted list, which grabs our room list here from our query selector all. It turns it into an array because apparently it's not an array already because JavaScript is weird. And then it calls sort, where it passes in an A and a B, and then it's going to do comparisons between A and B. So it's just A is one room, B is another room. You can, of course, rename this if you want to. It then created a const a last message is equal to a.querySelectorAll, where we grab the .last message dash time, which was something I had to add, question mark dot dataset question mark dot time. So the reason why I did the question marks here with the dataset time is because we are setting it in our our room or whatever. Where is it in here? We're setting the thing in the last message thing. We're setting the time in the data here. But of course, if you haven't sent a message in the room yet, you don't have any data there. So it's going to be null in that case. So that's why we're doing the question marks, because we're doing the null coalescing, which basically means it tries to call .dataset only if this thing right here exists. So if this is null, then it doesn't try to call this stuff. And then we do the same thing after dataset, so it doesn't try to call time if the dataset doesn't exist. So that gives us our first one. We can then come in here and we can do the same thing for the B query selector, and we'll change this to the B last message. So at this point, we have the A last message and the B last message. We now need to do some comparisons. And here it gave me like 2 or 3 different groups of if statements, and I just sort of combined them. And instead what I went with was a.querySelector. I grabbed the last message time .dataset.time. And again, here you can do your question marks just to make sure it works. I said, if this is equal to undefined, then return 1. Else if, we can copy this, paste it in, change this to B. If B is undefined, we return -1. And then else, you do, return A last message greater than B last message, question mark, -1, else 1. So this is a little bit gross because it is a ternary inside of an if statement. I would really suggest refactoring this so that you don't have like nested levels of logic. But for the sake of a tutorial, I think this is fine. It's just if you want cleaner code, I would really suggest like refactoring this whole thing into its own function and then refactoring this probably into another function, because I really don't like having all this logic in one single function. But okay, we have this set up. We can now scroll back up to the top where we had our sorted list and our initial modify rooms. So we're now modifying the rooms correctly. This is editing Dean here. Just wanted to real quick say that my mic cuts out from this point forward. So I'm going to try my best to dub over this, but I do apologize if I miss anything. The first thing I want to point out is in the sort by last message, there's actually a bug. The A last message and the B last message should be using the A.query selector and B.query selector. It doesn't need to be using the all. That'll break it. And you can actually replace the if statements with the A last message and the B last message respectively. The other thing is the sorted list for each needs a parentheses to unbreak it. Now, if we go ahead and we check out the actual application and we try to refresh, we should, we would expect to see it to sort, but it's not going to sort as long as we have that bug there. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time here figuring it out. So I'll try and cut that out. Also, there's currently a bug with active storage and the file not found errors. I'm not sure if that's something that everyone will run into or if it's just a me issue. I deleted my storage files, and ever since then I've been running into that issue. But we can go ahead and we can test sending a message into one of the chat rooms now, and you'll see that the timestamp updates for that specific chat room without any errors in the console, but it doesn't update for all of the, or it doesn't reposition it in the list. And that's because we're only doing the initial modify rooms at this point. We're not doing all of the modify rooms. So in order to modify the rooms whenever a change happens, we need to use something called a mutation observer. And that we'll talk about that in a second, but basically that's just going to listen for changes on the rooms DOM element. So whenever the rooms DOM gets something added to it, it'll modify what the list order needs to be. And it does this through this Firefox mutation observer. I had a whole bunch of funny jokes for this, but basically Firefox found a blog post that used something that they did, or Mozilla did, and then they posted this article which has a example of how to use the mutation observer with the observer API to create something that can listen not just for changes to a DOM element, but for changes to children in the DOM element. So you have your attributes, your child list, and your subtree, and all of those are things you can listen for changes to. So whenever a change occurs, let's say in our rooms list, we have a bunch of rooms. Whenever one of those rooms gets updated because their time gets updated, then this will reflect those changes, and it'll call a function to say, hey, you need to go update these things. So I'm going to paste in the comments as we go through here, just to sort of preserve what the Mozilla article had for us. We're going to start off by creating the config, which is going to have three different options for it. It's going to be the attributes, which we're setting to true, the child list, which we're setting to true, and the subtree, which we're setting to true. And of course, I forgot the equal sign here, which normally would just get fixed in editing, but because I'm doing a voiceover, we're going to lose some of that magic. Now, the next thing is to create this callback function, and this callback function is going to take in I think it's a mutation list and maybe a second argument. I think it's the observer that needs to go in. Okay, so we can go ahead and close that. And the next thing is it's just a quick little note for, I guess, if you're using Internet Explorer, which, gross. But then we're going to create a for loop where we say for const mutation of mutation list. So it's like an enhanced for loop, basically. And then we check if the mutation type is a child list. And this is pretty much the only mutation type we actually have to check for, I think. And this will fire the updates to the actual list, or at least it'll fire this block of code whenever we send a message or receive a message. And when it fires this block of code, we want to, I guess we can console log what Firefox had, and then we want to call modify rooms, where we pass in what I thought was the list of rooms here, but I actually end up refactoring most of this. Basically, the rooms are just passed in at the top of the function, as you can see, and I wasn't really paying attention to what I was doing here. I think here is actually where I catch on to it. But yeah, so the Firefox article sort of does a check for the element inside of the function, and I decide that we don't need to do that because we already found it previously. So instead, we'll just create a sorted list by calling sort by last message, which of course is still broken for me right now. We pass in the list of rooms to the modify rooms, then we pass in the sorted list, the observer, and the target node and the config. Now the target node isn't needed. I think I also realized that in a little bit here. Basically, the target node is synonymous with the rooms. So the target node is just the thing that you're updating when it changes. So in this case, it's the list of rooms that we're updating, so we don't need the target node as well. So now let's come down here and let's actually define this function for the modify rooms function. And it's going to take in all of the same arguments. You can see there the GitHub Copilot was trying to help by changing it to modify users because it's a little bit ahead of where the script is. But we copy all of this in and then we add in our parentheses. And this function's pretty simple. So basically, the first thing you do is you disconnect the observer the same way that we disconnect this controller or we connect it, because we don't want the observer listening for changes, because this modify rooms function is going to modify the rooms. So every time you call modify rooms, it changes the room, then the observer sees an update, it calls modify rooms, then the observer sees an update, and you see what happens. You get sent into an infinite loop. So we make sure that while we're inside this function, we stay disconnected, and then we can modify as we need. We then set the rooms inner HTML to be the empty string, and then we do a for each on the sorted list. So we say for each room in the sorted list, we need to, and I think I'm explaining why I went with sorted list instead of rooms here. Basically, we're saying for each of the rooms inside of the sorted list of rooms, we want to append the child room. So the sorted list of children are then appended to the rooms list. And then at the end, we say observer.observe, and we pass in the same arguments, but that shouldn't be target node. It should be the rooms instead. I probably missed that, but here's where I decide to refactor it, which again would have been lost to the magic of editing. But I'm trying not to cut too much because this is going to be pretty bad to sync up already. Okay, so at the end here, we create a instance of the observer. We just say const observer equals new mutation observer. We pass in the callback function. And then at the end, we just say observer.observe the same way we did in the modify rooms function. At this point, the room list should mostly be done, but I think I missed another parentheses somewhere, or I broke something in the sort list, which is probably also broken. So here I just call target.destroy to clean up the attachment there that was breaking everything. And then I try to send a message and I realize that stuff is still broken. So right here, I realize that the callback function doesn't need the rooms passed to it. And right here, I realize that the modify rooms needs to have the rooms passed into the observer. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to test it again. And I actually don't remember if it works here. So I send a message and it still doesn't work. And I think that's because I still haven't updated the sorted list or sort by room list or whatever function. And here is where I realize that the query selector all is being used. So I clean up that code and then I test it out after I do a refactor here where I switch it to A last message and B last message. So I guess this is nice. You get to see how I go about debugging stuff. I'm still cutting out a lot because this did take me a minute to find, but now I think I go in and I test this and hopefully I see the testing chat room move above the general chat room on the left, which it looks like it does. And you can see my cursor sort of flip out there because I'm excited. So now that that's fixed, we can actually move on to doing the user chat list as well. So we're going to go ahead and open up the user list. And this is going to be really similar to the room list to the point where what I do is I paste in the room list and then I just do a Control F for the word room. And anywhere where I have the word room, I replace it with user. And anywhere where I have the word rooms, I replace it with the word users. I'm also hitting F2 on the function names to do a refactor. So whenever I call the function and I hit F2 on it, it'll also replace the name of the function at its definition. So when I have like this dot initial modify users, I rename it and then it renames it at the actual modify users function location as well. So it's just a really neat way to do a bigger refactor. In retrospect, I could have done something similar for replacing the users and the user variables or the room and the rooms, but instead I decided to go through this entire thing while I told a story about refactoring. which of course has now been lost and I've completely forgotten about it because I muted my microphone to cough like a big dummy. But instead you get to listen to me talk and fill airtime while we go through this. So one of the things to note is, as you can see, this logic starts to get pretty messy here. And, it's one of those things where doing the tutorial, I would love to refactor this, but it's really not that educational for me to spend 4 hours refactoring code so that it's like industry standard. And here you can see that the user list is now working as well, just like the room list was previously. Okay, so that's going to do it for this tutorial. If you like this tutorial up until the point where I butchered everything with my audio, and you want to take this a little bit further, I did a video the other day where I covered doing some performance optimizations for Rails. So it covered stuff like n+1 queries and how to reduce them using the bullet gem. I covered doing batch transactions in your seed file. So if you have like 1,000 records to insert, you only hit the database once instead of 1,000 times. It also covered doing benchmark testing. So if you're trying to figure out how long a function runs in Rails, you can do your comparisons by using like something built into Rails to measure the time down to like the nanoseconds. If all that stuff's interesting to you, I'll have a link to that video on the screen right now.